Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. I'm sure you have heard there is an election coming up in the United States, and whether you favor Republican candidate Donald Trump or Democratic candidate Kamala Harris, the winner and their policies will have a profound effect on the supply chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I'm glad you have chosen to join me for this discussion. We're not going to get into choosing political sides today because this is not a political show. You can get plenty of that elsewhere out there in the world. But together with my guests, I hope we can answer some questions and perhaps outline a path forward for supply chain managers as you prepare for an uncertain 2025 and beyond post-election. Joining me on this journey of ours today is Alex Sarek, CMO of Ivalua, a provider of cloud-based spend management software. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me today.
Great. I'm glad you're with us. We're going to get into the discussion in a second. But to get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and a little about Ivalua?
Absolutely. Well, I've been in the spend management technology space for over 20 years now in different leadership roles spanning product management, delivery, and more recently marketing. Spent a lot of that time. It's given me an opportunity to work with hundreds of supply chain leaders on their digital transformations. And since 2017, I've been Chief Marketing Officer at Ivalua, where I lead our global marketing strategy and build leadership programs. For those unfamiliar with Ivalua, we provide a modular AI-powered source-to-pay platform. It's built completely from the ground up, a one code-based data model, and we can support every type of spend. And we work with hundreds of many of the most admired brands you're probably familiar with, whether it's Honeywell, the City of New York, IKEA, Volkswagen, Cleveland Clinic, and many others.
Yeah, great. So again, for our audience, neither one of us are political scientists, so we're not going to turn this into a political discussion, and we're not picking sides in this election. That's not our goal here today. What we are going to do is use the election kind of as a backdrop to illustrate the important role that risk mitigation has in your supply chain. Talk about it in that context, right? And so to get started, Alex, we talk about both Trump and Harris, and by extension, the Republican and Democratic parties, and all of them, they seem to have very different approaches to trade and tariffs. And trade, of course, as anybody in supply chain knows, is crucial, right? It's the supply chain and global supply chain. So avoiding the politics of the nature, can you kind of give us a brief summary of kind of different approaches that each party would likely take towards trade and how those policies could impact the supply chain going forward?
Sure. And if you look at the top level, they're actually more similar than different. Both of them are actually quite protectionist and kind of continue this recent trend. A big shift away from the free trade focus of the last few decades. But there are some important nuances between the policies that they're suggesting. Overall, I'd say we're looking at broader tariffs, but with a lot more clarity under a Trump Republican administration, and narrower tariffs, but with more uncertainty on the details under a Harris or Democratic administration. And more specifically, Trump is proposing very broad tariffs of 10 to 20%. Across virtually all imports, plus extremely high tariffs of around 60% on Chinese goods. He's also threatened reciprocal tariffs in any nation that imposes tariffs against the U.S. So overall, he's proposing a very broad but quite clear tariff policy. And there also don't seem to be any strings attached when it comes to ESG or other factors. Now, Biden and now Harris campaign is generally talking about more targeted tariffs, but they're providing a lot less detail. Seems that tariffs are going to be focused more on specific countries, specific goods, but we aren't really sure yet which ones. Biden had proposed increasing current tariffs on China, including really large ones of 100% on some goods like electric vehicles, semiconductors, and steel. It's still not clear if Harris is fully aligned with that. There also seems to be more appetite to trade policies that incentivize more sustainable goods with Democrats. So looks like it's going to be more narrow, more focused, but probably more piecemeal, less certainty under a Democratic administration.
Yeah. And I'll mention, just for those of you listening, we are recording this on September 3rd, about a week before there's supposed to be a debate. So depending on when you're listening to this, these things that Alex is talking about may have changed by then, because that's what happens in politics, and things change quickly. But I think the conversation and the base that we're dealing with here is good to discuss and these impacts. So as we talk about trade and tariffs in China, each party obviously has very different views, as you kind of mentioned a little bit there. But supply chain managers have been focused on diversification, not just in suppliers, but also the regions. And it's been a big thing since COVID, right? So I wonder, how should supply chain managers approach these next few months leading up to the election, given the different views on trade and tariffs, especially as they map out their 2025 priorities? Is staying the course the best at this moment? Because it's kind of what they've been doing, right?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Given the uncertainty around not just who's going to win, but the policy preferences and what's actually going to be implemented, and often there's a big disconnect there, if you know history.
Yeah.
Personally, I feel making any kind of drastic preemptive changes in anticipation of a specific policy is a really bad idea. It's gambling at this point. But at the same time, that doesn't mean just standing by and not doing anything. It is going to be a dynamic environment. There are going to be changes. So I think it is very important for anyone that has a great dependency on global supply chains to ensure they're in a position to make quick, informed decisions based on the policies that actually come into force. And I'd suggest two things that are really important to do now. First is really work to ensure you have the visibility in the supply chain that's required. And that means more than just knowing who the immediate suppliers you buy from, but also the sub-tier, who they're buying from. So
Hmm.
you can quickly assess the impact of any policy and how it's going to impact you and how you may have to change. And then second is, I think it's perfectly reasonable, and I would highly recommend that companies start stress testing likely scenarios to identify vulnerabilities to different policies, whether that's a huge increase in tariffs on everything from China or tariffs on specific commodities that are purchased abroad. And then start looking at contingency plans so you can have those in place and quickly implement based on what actually comes to force.
Yeah. The U.S. is not the only country with elections this year. I think at one point I read there was like 120 other countries having elections this year. And given the global nature of trade these days, changes in government can make a big difference in the way companies deal and get goods. I read, I think it was last week, I think I read about a Mexican government plan to overhaul their judicial system, which seems like, what do we care about that, right? But the talk is that if they do that, that could really have an impact on the USMCA trade agreement that the US, Mexico, and Canada have. So I guess my point on this is that not just US elections, but global elections, right? There's always the chance that a new government comes in any country and changes the dynamic that you're dealing with. Given that, how, as far as managers go, how do supply chain managers react to that? I mean, I can't imagine that we can be aware of every single country that is having an election at any given year, right? So how do you build a path forward where a change in government doesn't in any single country doesn't change your supply chain
Yeah,
significantly?
and it's a good point to keep in mind. I mean, we are very focused on the U.S. election, and even abroad, people are very focused on what happens here because it reverberates around the world. But there are changes taking place all the time in individual countries, and on top of that, of course, natural disasters, wars, and other things that impact supply chains. So you can never really sit back and be comfortable. Rest assured, you aren't at risk. No, I don't see any supply chain that can be built that's immune to any kind of policy changes going on, just because there's such a big variety, and there's always going to be some dependence for most companies abroad. But you can build more resilient ones where likely changes of policy can be mitigated by shifting supply among existing suppliers rather than recreating the whole supply chain, which
Yeah.
is risky, it's disruptive, and likely very costly. And I think you mentioned, before, I think diversification is a key part of it. You probably don't want to split supply too much because that complicates operations, reduces leverage, and impacts relationships. But you definitely want to be more stable, and you want to avoid single sources of supply to ensure that you have alternates available that have diverse risk profiles. The one strategy I think does make sense to be a little more proactive on is around China, reducing exposure there. There seems to be really broad consensus, and not just across both parties in the US, but even more and more talk out of Europe on making restrictions apply on China. So maybe, China plus one that a lot of companies shifted to, maybe that becomes Asia plus one, and that plus one is a nearshore or onshore supplier for some key categories. So there's some things to do to hedge your bets, but it's going to be tricky, and we just have to stay really agile.
But I mean, ultimately, in this day and age, not just from a geopolitical perspective, simply just being in one country, unless that's the only option, is probably not the best approach.
No, absolutely not. And it's not just about international exposure. I mean, look, if during COVID, you had 100% of your supply base in the United States, which was very unlikely, but let's take that scenario. Well, when COVID shut down parts of the US, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
So it's not just about not limiting exposure to China or Asia or distant suppliers. It's you really need to diversify.
Yeah. I want to ask you about kind of planning and preparing for these things. So, going back to the US election, there are a lot of different scenarios here, right? We could have a Democratic president, a Republican control of both houses of Congress. We could have a Republican president, Democratic control of Congress. Maybe there's a split Congress. Maybe one party has total control of the entire government, right? And depending on how what scenario plays out there, also could impact those trade. Trump may not be able to get all his tariffs if he has a Democratic Congress, right? That there may be pushback there, and it may be more difficult to do that. So from the supply chain, and as you map out possibilities for the election, right, and what your supply chain may look like and the impacts it may have going forward, are there ways out there, is that technology available or something that allow you to map out these various scenarios regardless of the outcome there? I mean, and how do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's another important topic. I mean, split government is a very real possibility, and it can lead to a lot of compromises. You have no idea which way, not just on tariffs, but even in areas that can impact supply chains like labor laws, ESG guidelines. So really, I mean, ultimately, supply chain resilience hinges on the ability to nimbly adjust your strategies in response to these changes that are taking place. And rather than trying to guess what a particular results may actually come into force, you really want to go ahead and start wargaming these and building out. And I think there are a couple things that are important from a technological aspect. I mean, the first is building a single source of truth for supplier information is absolutely critical. It's essential for you to actually just understand your overall vulnerability and then start, kind of wargaming based on that. Especially when you start looking at meeting competing business objectives beyond just, risk, but also cost, sustainability. So you really need to establish kind of a single source of truth there. And I think the other technology that can help be more predictive as well is AI. It's come a long way. It's increasingly helping pull information from a lot of different sources, including what's going on out in the web, identify the likely impact, and even suggest mitigation strategies. And as more data becomes available, AI is really good at pulling it together, and it can play a really important role in identifying high-risk categories, kind of quantifying the gaps between what we have and what new policies may mandate, and even making recommendations. I mean, at Value, we have like a market intelligence capability where you can quickly assess what's the current state, what are likely risks, as well as what are mitigation strategies that you can consider to stay ahead of those.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you mentioned AI, and I don't think I can ever have any conversation with anybody without AI coming up in it these days. So I guess it's a good place any. I was going to ask if you should just build one plan, right, for the election, or maybe with AI it allows you to build a plan for each scenario. I mean, is it worth the time to build a plan for all the possible scenarios?
I mean, I think, well, let's see, all is tricky because there's so many infinite variations, especially when you start getting into, strings attached between, made in USA requirements and sustainable requirements. So I don't know if it's probably infinite if we want to look at all, but I think it's absolutely feasible to build plans and kind of assess the impact across, all the likely and perhaps some other kind of obvious potential ones that are less likely. And ultimately, I think you want to, at this point, build a preferred plan that's going to most likely support, and then have a bunch of variances. The other thing to keep in mind is it's not just going from A or B. I think in a lot of cases you're going to need transition plans, especially when it comes to goods that may have developed supply chain hubs. Like auto manufacturing in Detroit, where you have multi-tier suppliers all kind of in close proximity to another. And so, something very similar has happened in China over recent years for a range of industries. And these clusters develop together and have a tremendous amount of efficiency. So reducing dependence on Chinese hubs, for example, you're not going to get that same level of efficiency anytime soon. And be able to replicate these kind of integrated ecosystems in new markets. It takes time. So in the interim, costs are going to be higher. You may have to come up with, less optimal supply chain structures. And the risk of disruption is going to be greater too in that interim.
Yeah. Yeah. The, I mean, we're talking, I mean, all of this goes back to risk assessment, risk scenario planning, risk mitigation, diversification, et cetera. But in many ways, as I think about it, I think that an election is ultimately your ultimate risk scenario, right? We can kind of map out, because we have history with this, right? What happens if a strike shuts down the ports? And that's something we may be dealing with on the East Coast soon. Um, we know kind of what's going to happen to supply chains if a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, for instance, right? Because we've gone through this, we have this data and this history. We don't know what's going to happen when a new leader is elected, president or whatever the premier or whatever the country that happens to be in. We don't know what's going to happen there. And I think one of the things I think of a lot on this is the George Bush presidency in 2001 when we had 9/11, right? How did 9/11 change the trajectory of the Bush presidency? How did it change the trajectory of this country, right? There was a lot of things that changed because of that, and that's not something we ever could have predicted, obviously. So as you have these concerns, I think the question gets down to visibility in your supply chains, right? And how well you know the people in the supply chain, so that when something unexpected like a 9/11 happens, for instance, we can adjust to that. So, and you talked about visibility earlier. So I was wondering if you kind of expand on that a little bit. When we get into visibility, is it just in your own supply chain, or because of these different scenarios that could play out around the world, do we need to go even deeper into supply chains and into your suppliers, and even maybe their suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, the visibility it's absolutely key. That's just a must-have these days. It just given the uncertainty taking place, and the need and the gap, like you said, it's particularly critical when it comes to that sub-tier. It's not enough to just know your suppliers. Very few organizations have really mapped out that sub-tier, but without that visibility, there's no way to really understand the risk in your supply chain. And going back, I mentioned COVID before. There was a lot of analysis done and some great examples. One was an analysis by Dun& Bradstreet that was really interesting and I think illustrates this well. They found that when COVID struck in China and in the Wuhan region originally, only 16% of the Fortune 1000 had an immediate supplier in that area. But when you look just one level below to their suppliers, 94% had a tier 2 supplier there. So very few thought that they had any exposure. And they didn't realize it until they were actually impacted, because suddenly their supplier couldn't provide the goods because their suppliers were shut down. So getting to that level of visibility, it's key. And it really depends on establishing a single source of truth for the supplier data. I mentioned before. And the easy, elegant way to do it is through a unified platform where everything in real time kind of syncs to one record. But if you've already committed to a best of breed approach, like some companies have, implementing a data lake on top of it is really important. And then giving suppliers access to those systems so that they can actually enter the information on the sub-tier dependencies. Doing it that way, it's a lot more scalable. It allows you to avoid duplicates among suppliers, and it also lets you map the dependencies across different suppliers, looking at the sub-tier. It's really interesting when you map these out, and we have visual ways to do that, how dependent many organizations are on the sub-tier supplier that happens to be serving all the immediate suppliers. So that's really critical to do. Give the suppliers access so they can provide the sub-tier and have a single point where you can map all the information. And that really forms the foundation to being able to navigate this environment.
Yeah. And then that's, I mean, I know that's something we all talk about, but so many businesses still have not done that.
Yeah, very few have. I would say it's single digit that have actually mapped that through. It's shocking how low the visibility is into the sub-tier.
But I think in this day and age, I mean, COVID showed it to us, obviously. I mean, the other instances in the history that, it's so critical to really know this and know the impact that it could have, and something like this could happen. Some random country could change leadership, in the middle of Asia somewhere, small country, maybe a small country, and then suddenly your supply chain shuts down because that new leader decides that he's not working with U.S. companies anymore. So it's really important, I think, to have that level of visibility all the way down to those, even the smallest suppliers.
Yeah, it's critical. And there's a lot of reasons why companies have
discussion's been about diversification. Yeah.
No, there's a lot of reasons why companies haven't done it. Sometimes there's been pushback, but I think as the collaboration's tightened, a lot more suppliers are willing to share the information, and it really, you have to kind of insist upon it, at least for key categories.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked a lot of this has been about risk mitigation, diversification, visibility, et cetera. And diversification is certainly not going away of your supply chain. It's not going away in any way whatsoever. Um, can you kind of look at the high level approach of this though? And because one of the things that I'm always curious about is, what is enough diversification, right? How much diversification is enough? And then as you think about it and say, hey, we need more and we need more and we need more, how do you manage that network that gets bigger and bigger and bigger? I mean, it could end up spanning 50 countries and thousands of suppliers at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the goal of diversifying the supply chain is to reduce the overall risk and ensure that no one particular shock is going to disrupt all sources of supply for a commodity and just shut you down. And to do that, you really need to manage your supply chain the way an investor manages a portfolio, where diversification is an age-old kind of tenet. And it really comes down to looking at the risks, like in their case, of individual investments, as well as how specific risks are going to impact the overall portfolio.
Mhm.
And if you think about managing your own portfolio, building one that's lower risk isn't just about selecting low risk investments. And too often with supply chains, companies are doing due diligence in the supplier and picking low risk suppliers, but that's kind of the limit. Uh, you're looking at bonds, for example. You can look at investment grade bonds. They're a really low risk investment. They're considered to be a lot lower risk than stocks. But if your portfolio consisted entirely of them, and when interest rates just shot up over the past year, you took a pretty big beating because they're all exposed to the exact same risk. And the
Yeah.
same thing can happen with suppliers. Like I mentioned before, if they're all onshore and nearby, well, if COVID shut down your region, you're in trouble. So diversifying your supply chain really involves ensuring you have your alternate suppliers for a specific good or a service, where each alternate supplier has a distinct risk profile. So it doesn't mean you need to have 20. You can just have a handful. It could be three, but they're just not exposed to the same kind of primary risks. So you want to look at the key risks and make sure all the suppliers for a specific category aren't going to be severely impacted by one event, like huge tariffs hitting China or a closure of a key shipping route, the Suez Canal, what have you. And to do that effectively, I mean, yes, you need to have, like I mentioned before, that 360-degree visibility of the suppliers, including this sub-tier, to assess all the factors. And then go in and category at the category by category view, make sure you have an alternate. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be 100% covered with alternate suppliers for every single category, but at least for the key ones, you want to be sure that you're not going to have a near-term shutdown when you consider the capacity of your suppliers as well as your inventory levels.
Yeah. And I've heard other people talk about this too. But just when you look at diversification, right? I think many companies simply look at the bottom line. It's like, what's cheapest here? And there are other considerations that it may be cheaper, but it may put you at more risk
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
a
That's the
way.
case.
So
And the same thing happened, I mean, even with inventory, where for a while we were operating so lean, very efficient, very low cost. And then suddenly when the supply was disrupted, they realized how costly that strategy was. And now companies
yeah,
are building inventory again.
yeah, yep. Alex, thank you so much for your time today to discuss this. We are just about done and out of our time. So I want to thank you. If people want to get in touch with you or Evalua, how would they go about doing that?
You're always welcome to reach out to me directly at asa@ivalua.com. Or if you're interested in learning about, Ivalua can help global organizations stay agile and optimize their supply chains. And today's uncertainty, you can go to our website, ivalua.com. It's IVALUA.com, and click on contact us, and someone will be happy to get back to you.
Great. Great. I want to, all of you listening out there, I want to encourage you to go out and vote this November, regardless of which candidate you support. It doesn't matter to me who you support, but just participate in the process. That's what they say. As they say, elections have consequences, and supply chain is going to be feeling them for many years to come. But I think that today, Alex kind of gave you some ideas on how to approach this, and regardless of which party is in power in Washington, and some ways that you might be able to reduce some of your risk and exposure to some of these changes that might take place. I want to thank my guest today, Alex Sarek, for joining me, and all of you who took time out of your day to listen. I thank you very much. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.